So that little clip was of my son when he was learning to play t-ball. Not. Obviously, some of you will recognize that from Mad TV's skits that they used to put on, and this is one of many that featured Stuart. And one of his primary responses to life was, "No, let me do it." And that illustrates really a truth for us today, a very profound truth, really, in terms of our relationship with God and the world's relationship with God. The video we saw earlier about the day of the Lord also spoke to this very point, that when God gave his directions to live a life that could be abundant, that could be everything that is possible for us as created beings, we still rebelled and wanted to do it our own way. And so because of that, we suffer. Now, you probably have been wondering why I'm off to the side. It's because I've discovered a new feature. Are you ready for it? Are you? You sure? Some of you are shaking your head. Some of you are like, you can't see me. Ta-da! There you go. Now you can see my lovely face all the time as we're going through the message. Many of you had complained that you were just enjoying looking upon my vestige and then it would disappear for times. And that was just disconcerting for you. Well, now I've taken care of that by giving you my face all the time. So you're welcome. Anyway, we as human beings, the world is not excited generally about following God's way. The tendency is we want to do it our own way. I mean, we like the fact that we can think back and say, I did it my way, like the song says. We like that. And unfortunately, we're kind of like the little child who sees a fan for the first time and is fascinated by it and wants to stick their hand in it to touch it. Of course, the child has no idea what is waiting when that touch happens, but a parent does, and the parent will grab their hand and say, no, no, and try to tell them not to go near that fan, not to try to touch it. And they don't understand at first. In fact, they may even cry and be a little bit upset. Why? Because they really wanted to touch it, and they see the parent's intervention as an encumbrance, restricting them. And in reality, it is a guarantee of their safety and a way to keep them from pain and struggle. And so that is really the way it is when you come to our relationship as human beings to the Father's, to God's. We tend to want to pull away and do our own thing. And this is really what Psalm 2, the psalm we're going to look at this morning, is all about. Now, a few items of review, just to remind you. Remember that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 both comprise an introduction to the entire book of Psalms. And when the Psalms, as we have them now, were put into the structure they are to these 5 books, Psalm 1 and 2 were put up front as sort of a preview of 2 major themes that would be carried all the way through to the end of the book of Psalms. And so if you remember in Psalm 1, that major theme was that God has given us instructions. And if we are willing to follow those instructions, to meditate upon, to delight in them, and then meditate upon them, make them a part of our lives, we will see prosperity. We will see happiness, blessing. It may not always come in having all your circumstances right, but it certainly will be there in terms of your sense of security and peace in the presence of God. What the New Testament calls the abundant life that Jesus promises us. But now we get to Psalm 2, and we see the idea that started in Psalm 1, which was mainly focused on individuals, and this choice they have of either going their own way or following God's instructions, now is expanded to the nations around Israel. And the same two choices are offered, but now what is being promoted is through Psalm 2, because Psalm 2 is actually a royal psalm. It was written initially for the coronation of the king. Probably King David was the first coronation that it was used at, we guess. And you see that element of the throne of David being talked about all the way through the first three books of Psalms. But this psalm was given to help in that celebration of the coronation of the king. And we see that in this psalm now, the point that it's trying to make that will be carried throughout the rest of the book of Psalms is that God reigns. God reigns. He reigns through his king, and his reign never fails despite what the circumstances are around us that might say otherwise, that God reigns. So resistance to his reign is really futile. It's kind of like in Star Trek, the Borg, resistance is futile. Okay, so that's another obscure reference that maybe not all of you are following, but anyway, you catch the idea. It is futile. So the psalmist then starts out by asking a rhetorical question. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? So the psalmist expresses his disbelief at the way the nations of the world around him are acting toward the rule of God by asking this rhetorical question. And he uses these words, uproar, the nation's in an uproar, they're devising a vain thing. I mean, it may seem somewhat harsh or somewhat exaggerated, rather, or dramatic. And you're certainly going to get that all the way through this psalm. In fact, you will get that through every psalm. One of the things that is unique about the genre of the Psalms is that they are intentionally dramatic and intentionally emotional in nature. And that's part of the reason why we're drawn to them. We like reading the Psalms. They seem to touch us at our core because of that emotional aspect. That they're not afraid to express emotions that aren't necessarily God's emotions, but maybe the emotions of the psalmist or those who are reading it at the time. And so he uses these two words, uproar and devising this vain plan, to kind of communicate this sense of disbelief, but also he uses those words to communicate what would normally be the case if you had one enemy and another enemy facing off towards each other. If you had your enemy facing you and you heard they were angry, they were in an uproar towards you, that would tend to engender fear in you. And then if you heard they were putting together plans, they were devising plans against you, again, that would make you nervous. That would make you even more fearful normally. But the psalmist contrasts that in this next verse when he says, this is what's happening. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. So the psalmist has really articulated here in these two verses what it is that is causing this uproar and this plans that they are devising, that they're tired of the constraints. Fetters and cords are images of this idea of constraining, restricting, controlling. They're tired of the control, the constraints that God and his teaching puts upon humanity. They want nothing to do with it. They want to push away from it and do their own thing. So the nations of the world see the instruction of God and even his very presence then as really an encroachment upon their rights. Now, it's important for us to see that the psalmist here is talking from the perspective of his day, and we are somewhat affected by the perspective of our day when we come to Psalms and passages like this, especially in the Old Testament. We often bring with us baggage that will cause us to see things that aren't necessarily what is there, or to not see things that are there, or at least not understand what is there. One of the things that we do bring, one of the little bags that we bring with us when we come to the Old Testament, is the notion of pluralism. In our society, we've been taught that what you believe is fine for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's needful for everybody else. Everybody has their own beliefs, and that's perfectly fine, and we should live in harmony with that and accept that. Yet in the biblical world, that is not the way they saw the reign of God. God, they understood, was God, the only true God. And so when they saw the nations rejecting him and setting up their own gods, it wasn't a matter of, well, that's your way, this is our way, let's come together and live in harmony. It wasn't that way at all. In fact, even the pagan nations didn't buy into that kind of existence. And so when the psalmist writes, he is perplexed because this is the one true God, and yet the nations are rejecting him, and they refuse to follow him, and they are in an uproar. They're making their plans. What's going on in God's mind? Which is where the psalmist then turns in verse 4. He who sits in the heavens, he says, laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. So here again, notice the emotionality, the drama. You get this picture of God sitting up there laughing and slapping his leg and saying, oh, they're so stupid, those human beings. And some people could read that and think, well, that's kind of offensive because, God's making fun of them. He's scoffing at them. He's being sarcastic. But that isn't really the point. What the psalmist is trying to do through this emotional expression is to get across to the reader, to those who are hearing this psalm, that God is not affected by the nations being in an uproar or making their plans. God doesn't really care about that. It's not like he is scared about that. He's not afraid that his own plans are going to be somehow subjected to other things that are out of his control. They're going to be somehow thwarted. He knows that what he plans to do, his sovereign will come to pass, that he is in control despite what the circumstances may say. But then the psalmist goes on to tell us that then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. These nations around Israel, as the psalmist sees them, and their lack of responding to God as they should, as God, is ultimately, the psalmist says, going to lead to the wrath of God against them. And the fact, he says here, that he has installed his king, that word installed, it's a Hebrew word. Some translations use the word consecrated. It actually describes the anointing of oil that was done whenever a king was chosen. When the Spirit of God came upon a king, for instance, King David, when he said, this is the man I have chosen. Because remember, Saul was chosen primarily from by the people, driven by the people, and God ratified that. But it was David who was chosen by God himself, and he was anointed with oil. And that word that we have here, installed, other translations consecrated, is that Hebrew word. And this anointing really points to the fact that despite the rejection of the nations, God has already established his rule through the king that is being consecrated to the throne at that time. Now, this also points to the fact that it is God, the result of God's direct involvement. So the psalmist goes on then and does something interesting in the psalm. The perspective changes slightly from the psalmist's perspective as a third party writing about what he is seeing going on between the nations and God and what he hears God saying. Now he puts out there the words of the king himself, what the king would be saying. And so we see, I will surely tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, and notice that it's the king who's been anointed and set on the throne, is now being told by God, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall scatter them like earthenware. Interesting. Now, this is where Psalm 2 perhaps gets a little bit interesting and difficult to navigate. I said earlier the psalm is a royal psalm. It is, but it also is a eschatological psalm and a messianic psalm. Let me explain those two terms. It's eschatological in the sense that it talks about things that have yet to happen. They're not happening now. The circumstances don't look like it. Certainly as Israel read this psalm after the book of Psalms was put together, which would have been after their captivity, and they're coming back. There's still a lot of nations that are much stronger than they are. There's still the struggle that's going on of Israel trying to gain some sort of foothold. All of that's still happening. There's still the threat of being attacked again, overwhelmed again. They still feel the heavy boot of some pagan kingdoms on their neck. And so the idea that this wonderful promise of God that the king, all he has to do is ask and the nations will be his to rule, would seem very far away. This idea of him being the son is really not that uncommon in that culture. Even a lot of the pagan cultures saw their kings as sort of progeny of their gods, whoever they were. And that's something that carries over into the Old Testament as well. But of course, I said that this psalm is also messianic. And that means that this psalm really reflects things that are true about Christ's rule as king. And Jesus Christ, when he came and was incarnate in the flesh, he came into, in the human side of his existence, he came into the line of David. So he sits on the throne of David. He is the one, the Messiah, which, interesting, in our text, we heard that or saw that name, the anointed. That's what that word is. It's where we get our word Messiah, Messiah, which is the Hebrew for Messiah. And so Jesus is the Messiah, and he is also the Son of God. And you begin to see how there is a huge connection between what is said here in 2 and Jesus Christ. But at the time that the psalmist is writing, at the time that the people are looking at this, they're not necessarily aware, oh, Jesus is coming, in 400 plus years, and then he'll be sitting on David's throne. They know the Messiah has been promised, but they're primarily looking at the king that they are now putting on the throne to try to lead them, and hopefully lead them in the way that God is instructing. Of course, we know historically that many of the kings of Israel did not do that. And so the promise that God gives them did not come to fruition because they weren't able to lead as they should. Also, you'll notice the word begotten. And he's not saying that he's born of God, but that in the moment that he is anointed and consecrated as king, he becomes sort of this surrogate son. Now, what is the point of all this? It is that God is reigning through the physical king on earth, just as we know now from our perspective today that God reigns through his son, Jesus Christ. And the promise that God gives this king, his son, who rules as an extension of God's rule, will have the power, is that he will have the power of God on his side. And he will rule with strength. He uses two interesting figures here, two pictures. He'll break with a rod of iron and shatter them like earthenware, his enemies. And in the Old Testament, and also in ancient cultures that were part of the Old Testament, the imagery of an iron rod was an image of strength. That's why in the Old Testament, oftentimes you'll see described, chariots, and they'll make mention of the fact they're iron chariots because they want to emphasize the strength of the chariot. And this image of broken earthenware, interestingly, if you look into the archaeological findings, they've discovered that many of these cultures around would sort of ceremonially place on pots, clay pots, inscribe the names of their enemies, and then the king would sort of ceremoniously break them with his rod or with his staff, with his scepter, smashing them to pieces as a way of saying, this is what we will do to our enemies as God leads us forward, or as our God, whichever their God was, leads them forward. So picking up this same imagery, the psalmist says, this is what is true of the Son, the King that God has enthroned upon his throne, will do as he follows God's lead. And then the psalmist brings out what he brought out in the first psalm, and that is two choices. Just like in the first psalm, we had the two choices between either I'm going to accept the instruction of God and make it a part of my life, or I'm going to reject it. And there's two consequences to both of those. So it is with this idea that God reigns, that he rules, despite what the circumstances are. He says, now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son. Literally, and your study Bibles will probably show this. Literally, he says, kiss the Son, which is a symbol or a form of homage, a form of submission to the authority of a king. And he's saying, do homage, do submit to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way, which is certainly what God had said earlier in this psalm, that his wrath would come against them. His fury would be seen against them. For his wrath, he says, may soon be kindled. And then he ends with this statement that he began with in Psalm 1, verse 1. How blessed are all those who take refuge in him. So here the psalmist presents two choices to us that are present, always present. And they're a choice that both groups of people have that they can make, and as individuals we can make. Today we have the same response, because in reality the king is sitting on his throne, the king that God has anointed to be on the throne. And so we have an opportunity to choose to either submit to his rule and enjoy the freedoms that flow from that, or to see his rule as fetters and chains that have to be shoved off and broken, and that see it as encroachments upon our rights, and doing it our own way. We have those two same choices. In fact, when you look at Psalms, you really have to see it through these two lenses. First, the lens of the writer, the psalmist himself, and those Israelites that would have seen it back in the day it was written and in the day it was used, as it was included in the book of Psalms. But then we also have to see it through the lens of us today, as we have seen that the line of David has been fulfilled through Jesus himself, who, as that video we saw earlier portrayed, came and paid for, dealt with our problem, not by conquering sin, but by giving himself as like a lamb to be slain, to overpower that tendency to want to rebel and to push God's leading away from us and do our own thing. And so today we look forward to the time when that whole process is completed in the day of the Lord that is yet to come and Christ coming again. So we have these two choices. For those of you who have already made the choice, if the choice is rejection of God, you still want to do it your own way, then ultimately you need to know something, that it's like the little kid sticking his hand in the fan. You're going to suffer failure in the judgment of God, and it will be a suffering, a failure you will not be able to recover from. If, on the other hand, you have chosen to allow God's rule in your own life, then you have accepted his rule despite what you see around you. Then you have the beginnings of assurance, a hope that grows more and more as you walk with God. And no matter what those circumstances are telling you, that hope remains there and gives you a sense of security that God is in control. Now, for those of you who haven't made the choice yet, you still have those two choices out there before you. You can reject him, which may seem viable. And this is true really on a daily basis. Even as believers, we make one of these two choices every day. We may look at the circumstances and it seems to us, well, God really is not doing anything. He's really not active. Yet our sense of our desire to want to do it ourselves will only lead to futility and to destruction. However, the choice to accept God's rule despite what we see will mean an unshakable faith that will lead us into eternity. So really it comes down to, which way will you choose?